So before we get into more practice, I just wanted to give you a very, very simple demonstration of the three ways we can implement the listeners that we just started talking about. And so I told you that the kind of the way that we're going to mostly do it is this way. We did this in class. This is the most stylistically strong way to do it because we have loose coupling where the listener and J panel are separate. That way we can swap it out if we need to and not have any issues. But you're going to see examples of the other two as well. So first, let's do an example where the panel itself is the listener. The textbook likes to do this a lot. And also where the panel is going to contain a listener, but it's nested, which is not quite as loose of coupling as this, but a little better than this. So first, let's go to panel is the listener. And so the classes we're going to need are Smith panel, also listener, Smith panel with nested listener, Smith panel, and Smith panel listener. Okay, so first off, we're just going to do Smith panel, also listener. Okay, so this is going to demo having the listener class be, not Smith panel, the Smith panel, also listener. So this has the listener actually be the component. So I am listening in on myself. So notice if I have extends JPanel, I am the JPanel, implements mouse listener, I can also be the listener on myself. It's kind of weird. Now I've made this as simple an example as possible. So what we're going to have is this thing that just displays a string. The default is default. And then if I click, it'll say mouse clicked. If I press and hold, so if you hold, it'll say press. If you release in a different spot, it'll say released, right? If you release in the same spot, it'll say clicked, because that's what a click is it press, release in the same spot. Press, move it, and let go, it'll say released, okay? So very simple, but it models the exact stuff we want to do, right? We have a state, right? This is our state. Instance variable stores the state, just like we had the rectangle array and drawable array. We've got a main method. It's kind of awkward to have that in here because conceptually it should be separate, but just so we can keep it a little bit simpler. We're setting the content pane of our J frame as this J panel, right? The Smith panel is a J panel. Okay, so by default, I'm setting this up. Now, because I'm implementing mouse listener, it's going to go ahead and I added all the methods already. Let's see. Again, drawing. Paint component is I'm going to draw based on the state set by my instance variable. So I'm going to draw whatever this message is. Right? At first it's default, later on it'll be changing to clicked, and so on and so forth. So whenever I click, I'm going to set the state to be mouse clicked. If it's pressed, I'm going to set the state, which is the instance variable message, to be pressed. And if it's released, it'll set it to be released. Enter and exit, I'm just not going to do anything. I have to leave it there. Okay, so if you run yours, it's not going to work. Think about what are the key things that we tend to forget. See if you can pause the video and fix it, so it'll at least do that right now. Pause the video, see if you can fix it so it actually shows up. Okay, so first, hopefully you remember the one thing that we tend to forget is to register. Register the listener. Now here we can register the listener inside the constructor of this guy because I am the JPanel and I am the listener. So remember the syntax is component dot add whatever listener it is and then the listener object. So go ahead and write that, please. What would it be? So who is the component that generates? That's the JPanel. That's this. Add mouse listener. Now who is the listener? Well, that's whoever implements mouse listener. That is also this object. So it's this. So again, this is kind of a weird thing. When you see this dot add this, it's when it's both a listener and a generator. And in fact, this is implied, so you can even go like this. The textbook likes to show it like this, but I prefer having it both so you can see the syntax out fully. All right, that's one thing people tend to forget. The other thing, as I mentioned before, is even if you change the state, like we added the rectangles in the array last time, but if you don't show repaint, it's not going to show up. So if I just do it like this, if I try to run this guy, look, I'm clicking, nothing happened. But if I try to move it, it'll call repaint. It'll call paint component. Ah, that shows up. But I don't want to do it like that. I want to, as soon as the mouse is clicked, I want to say repaint. Now, how can I repaint? The nice thing is I'm inside, I am the JPanel. I'm inside the JPanel as well. So for this one, it's even easier. I can just say this dot repaint. Repaint the JPanel, right? And this is actually optional. You can even just say repaint. Right? This dot repaint or repaint. Okay, so this was an example of where the JPanel is the listener, right? We're doing this one right here. It's kind of bad style because it's not separated at all, but it gives us some nice ease of use things where we can just refer to repaint, and I can add the listener quite easily. If I run it now, click, there it is, move, release, yep, there we go. All right, so that's the first one. Second one, what about if I have the panel is going to have a nested listener class? Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at Smith panel with nested listener. Okay, so in Smith panel with nested listener, we see that we have got this guy right here. It's nested, and we can make it private. It's a listener, and so let's see. I've got all these methods. So see if you can actually pause the video and try to get it to work just like the previous one. Implement. Add the stuff you need to do. In other words, you need to alter the state here. Notice how this draws based on the state set by the member variables, which is called message. So see if you can get it to work. Pause it, and then we'll come back in a few moments here. All right, so hopefully you notice that, again, no drawing takes place in here, nothing with graphics, but you just change the state, which in our case is message, to be mouse clicked. Here you change the state to be mouse pressed, and here you change the state to be mouse released. All right, now that wasn't enough if you saw that, because, again, one of the main things we tend to forget is we need to register this listener. And so we could do it inside the listener class, but let's practice doing it inside the panel class instead. So let's create a constructor, public. I'm just going to copy and paste this, Smith panel with nested listener. I don't need to save a reference to the JPanel because this is in the JPanel class. But what I need to do then is first, let's set our message. Right now it's not initialized. Let's initialize our message to be default, so our initial state. And then, again, we have this always the same pattern. The syntax is the component that generates it, dot add listener, and then listener. So what would it be? Who's the component? Well, that would be, let's see, that would be, I'm in the panel class. That's this dot add mouse listener. Now, who's the listener? That's this guy here. I don't have a name for it, so actually I could have created a listener object down here, but I actually don't even need to give it a name. I could just create the object inside panel listener. And there we go. So that should be registered. And I could even do like a system out here to make sure. Blah. Just to debug here. So if I run that, yep. In fact, I'll show you the console. Blah blah. So it's actually registering, but if we saw here, it's not actually working properly. See if you remember what is the thing that people tend to forget as well. Oh yes, and that is to repaint. So if I do this dot repaint, wait a second, it's not working like last time. Why isn't this dot repaint working? Well, because remember, this refers to the current object. This doesn't work. This would refer to listener. We don't want that, right? Listeners can't repaint themselves. We want a component. So the difference is subtle here, but what we can do is we can actually just go like this, repaints. So this, there's no implied this in this case. Because this is nested, right? Because this is nested, we have access to Smith panels. We have access to Smith panels repaint method. Okay, so I actually cannot put this because I refer to the listener class. But if I do repaint, because I'm nested inside here, I have access to all those JPanel, those outer class methods. And so I can do that for this as well. repaint, no, that's not it, repaint. Okay, and then again I draw based on that state. I think, yeah, everything should be set up. Let's go ahead and run it. And now, yep, there we go. So that works. So nested class is another way to do it. You have the advantage of being able to access these guys' private variables and the repaint method without too much trouble. So we've just finished talking about having a nested listener, which gave us fairly easy access to those variables and methods. Now the kind of most consuming but the best stylistic is to separate it out completely. So we're going to have a separate listener. We're going to add some public interface to allow us to have this guy change the state of the panel, and then the panel will take that new state and redraw it in here. So let's go ahead and take a look at this method, which uses the concept of loose coupling. Okay, so inside Smith panel, now this is saying I've got just the J panel, and I've got a Smith panel listener, which is separate. Implements mouse listener. So I've got all 5 of these guys here. They set the message, but now we're already starting to experience problems, right? Message is an instance variable. It should be private. I keep forgetting to do that, but it should be encapsulated as private. So now I really can't access this. And so, yeah, I've got some issues. So I've got my constructor here setting message. I've got my paint component, which is drawing this, but we have no way for this state to be changed. What we need then is for this listener to have access. And so if you remember, what a listener needs then is we need to store a reference to the J panel, to the Smith panel. So let's have a Smith panel. Let's call it panel. And the strategy that we use, which I think is helpful, is in our constructor. Let's create a Smith panel listener. It's going to, every time I create a listener, let's just make yourself be forced to pass in a reference to the panel. That way, I will always, every listener object will have a reference to the panel that it is listening on. Okay, that way I have access to stuff like message. Right? That way I have access to stuff like message. So now I could say something like panel.message equals mouse clicked, except, oh yes, I encapsulated that properly, so that's not going to be legal. Again, what we want to do then is want to open up a public interface to change the state, right? So inside Smith panel, I just need to create some kind of setter. So let's just say public void set message string m, and we'll allow a way for people to come in and pass in and change the message from default to be mouse clicked or mouse pressed or whatever. Okay, so now I could say something like panel.setMessage mouse clicked, and now we should be good to go. Okay, mouse pressed, let's change that, and mouse released. Okay, you can pause the video, see if you can fix the other things that are wrong, if that helped you get unstuck. Okay, so hopefully you saw one main thing that we tend to forget is to register. So I saved a reference here, but I still need to register. I need to register. So I can do, again, the syntax is component.add listener. Okay, who is the component? It's panel. Mouse listener. Who is the listener? Well, I'm inside the listener class, so that would be this. Okay, so that's huge. Now it's all hooked up. Again, you can debug it by doing like system outs. It wouldn't have system outed because it wasn't set up before. Once you've done this, it would start system.outing. Okay, so now if I do this, I should have put system.outs. Oh, whoops, this is the wrong one. This, and nothing is happening. Again, another thing people tend to forget besides this, once you've done this, the state is changed, but it's not visually showing up yet. Panel.repaint. Don't forget about that one. So that is that. If we run it, still doesn't work. Again, if you want to pause the video so you can find it, it's somewhere on this screen. Okay, so hopefully you saw that, you know what, just because I defined the constructor here, again, this is just a specification saying whenever I create a listener object, I pass in a panel, everything gets set up, everything gets registered, great, great, great. But you know what, this happens whenever I create a listener object. Hey, look, here's main. I have not created a listener panel listener object. So I've created the panel, but let's go ahead and create the listener. So we can again say Smith panel listener, L equals new Smith panel listener. And again, I've set it so I can't just do this. I've set it so that you're forced to pass in a reference, and in this case it's called panel. And this is how everything gets hooked up. And again, I don't even need to name this because I have no use for this. I mean, later on, maybe you would have some use for it, but for now I can just go like this. And now I've created one, everything gets hooked up. If I run this, now everything is good to go. All right, so I just wanted to demonstrate for you again the 3 ways that we've seen. The panel could be the listener, which is probably the easiest but confusing for a later use. Panel contains a nested listener class, which you'll also see, and I think the best stylistically separated out, which requires you to open up public interfaces